Well, welcome to episode 207 of 10-Minute Record Reviews. And this time I'm going to talk about the very first album by the Clifford Brown and Max Roach Quintet from 1954, Clifford Brown and Max Roach. And this is, I think, a 1974 Japanese repress, which sounds minty and delicious. In terms of what to expect, well, the Brown-Roach Quintet is one of the great small groups in the history of jazz, particularly the hard bop era. They only lasted for 2 years before Clifford Brown was sadly killed in a car accident in 1956, but they made a huge impact. Their work is often considered to be amongst the very best that hard bop has to offer, but there's also a fair amount of bebop thrown in on this record particularly. And that's not too surprising because just like Miles, their work and the era they're working in and their own tastes and backgrounds bridge the bebop and the hard bop eras. The more frenetic style of bebop isn't really to my taste, but even so, you can't deny the brilliance of the playing on here, not just by Brown and Roach, but also by their sidemen, and particularly by Harold Land, their tenor saxophonist. It's worth noting too that this is a group which is co-led by a drummer, and unlike some drummers who knew how to hold their fire, Max Roach solos on every single track, which may get old if you don't like drum solos, but if you're a drummer, by contrast, you're absolutely going to love this record. In talking about the background of this record, I'd first of all like to acknowledge James Harrod, whose blog, Jazz Research, is an amazing resource, and I've leaned on it quite heavily for some of the history here. Max Roach was born in January 1924, possibly January 1925, in Newland, North Carolina. His family were part of the Great Migration North, and when Max was about 4, they moved up to New York to the Bedford-Stuyvesant area of Brooklyn. Max grew up singing, playing the bugle, but his thing was really drumming, and he showed a lot of proficiency. When he was 18 and leaving school, he got his first taste of the big time when he got a chance to sit in with the Duke Ellington Orchestra. His talent is obvious to all concerned, and he soon falls in with the whole jazz scene on 52nd Street. He makes his first recording in 1943 for Coleman Hawkins, but this is, of course, a time of great change in jazz as the pre-war and wartime sounds of swing are being ushered out slowly but surely by the, at first, after hours and then more mainstream sounds of bebop. And Roach, because of his talent, his youth, and the moment he arrives in the scene, is perfectly placed to become what he becomes, which is one of the first great bebop drummers. In the second half of the 1940s, right there in this crucible in New York, Roach plays not just with Hawkins, but also with Miles, with Bud Powell, with Dizzy, with Monk, with Charlie Parker, with the whole pantheon of hard bop players. And he's right there in Parker's Savoy sessions in 1945, which are often considered to be the very beginning of bebop on record. Like a lot of young players at the time, Roach is heavily influenced by Dizzy Gillespie, and not just in the area of bebop, but also in the area of Afro-Caribbean rhythms, which of course Dizzy had done so much to introduce to the New York jazz world, and Roach ends up going down to Haiti to study with Tiroro, who was a very traditional Haitian drummer. In the early 50s, he was also taking classical percussion studies at the Manhattan School of Music. He was always a very politically astute and aware guy, and he was very conscious of the way that the white musical establishment were basically exploiting black talent in jazz, as they had through almost every other era of music. And so in 1952, together with Charles Mingus, he co-founds Debut Records. The following year, the two of them took part in what was that label's greatest release and one of the greatest releases in jazz history, the concert at Massey Hall in Toronto, which also featured Dizzy, Bird, and Bud Powell. In 1953, for a bit of a change of pace, Roach goes out to LA to play with Howard Rumsey's Lighthouse All-Stars, who of course played at the famous Lighthouse Cafe in Hermosa Beach. He was replacing Shelly Manne on drums. A brief sidebar in the Lighthouse Cafe. The club first started hosting jazz concerts in 1949. Howard Rumsey, the bassist who was a key figure in all this, was from California and had previously played with Stan Kenton. He'd argued with Kenton around 1947, and that meant his time in that orchestra was done. He was in LA licking his wounds and approached the guy who ran the Lighthouse, John Levine, to see if he'd agree to let Rumsey pull jazz concerts together using a house band. The rest is history. It became an institution, and there are live recordings of the club made by Lee Morgan, Cannonball, Grant Green, Elvin Jones, Cal Tjader, and a whole bunch of others. As that engagement was winding down in early 1954, a local promoter, a guy called Gene Norman, approaches Roach and says, "Can you put a band together? I want to promote your tour." This is where we turn our attention to Clifford Brown, whom Roach knew through their mutual friend Dizzy Gillespie. Brown came from Wilmington, Delaware. He'd been playing the trumpet since he was 13. At this stage, he was about 23. After high school in 1948, he'd won a music scholarship to the University of Delaware, which strangely didn't have a music program. While he was at university, in 1949, he takes a trip to Philadelphia to take in some music, and there he meets Fats Navarro, the jazz trumpeter. Navarro was very impressed with Brown and starts to spread the word, and pretty soon, Brown is sitting in here and there with Dizzy Gillespie's orchestra. Within a year or two, he'd also sat in with Charlie Parker. He ends up playing with Tad Dameron, ends up playing with Lionel Hampton, played with Art Blakey through the winter of 1953-54, and actually appears on Blakey's Live at Birdland sessions. At this point, in early '54, Roach, who's in LA, reaches out through mutual friends and invites Brown to come out and see if they can put a group together. The first version of the Brown-Roach Quintet takes the stage in LA in early April 1954 with Sonny Stitt on tenor saxophone. That doesn't last. Apparently he wasn't much of a team player. He might have been letting the press know that actually he was the leader. And by the end of that month, when Gene Norman is reaching out to Max Roach and saying, look, can I record a live session? I actually want to put this on record. Stitt is out of the picture. When they played that date, which was recorded but not released at the time, they had Teddy Edwards on tenor, replacing Sonny Stitt, George Bledsoe on bass, and Carl Perkins on piano. Now I should point out, and it's probably obvious, this is not the Carl Perkins of Blue Suede Shoes fame. It's a different Carl Perkins, the one who played piano for the Curtis Counts Quintet. And tenor sax in that quintet was played by Harold Land. For the moment, Teddy Edwards still has the sax chair, and he stays with the quintet apparently until early July 1954. But then Clifford Brown gets married to his girlfriend, and the reception photographs now tell a different story about the quintet. Suddenly, in the frame are Harold Land, the piano player Richie Powell, who is Bud's brother, and the bass player George Morrow, presumably as new members of the quintet. Land, of course, had been with Counts' group. Morrow had been auditioned successfully after the first couple of bassists they tried out for the quintet hadn't worked out. Powell's appearance in the scene is actually the most fortuitous. He actually was from the East Coast, not the West Coast, but he happened to be out in LA at the time playing with Johnny Hodges' band. That lineup, now settled as of mid-July, plays at the Tiffany Club in LA for the rest of the month before, in August, they go into Capitol Studios to make this record. The record is produced by a guy called Bob Shad. It's recorded on August 2nd, 3rd, and 6th, and it includes a mixture of Clifford Brown's originals and several standards. The quintet went on to make 4 studio LPs between 1954 and 1956, plus a whole bunch of live recordings, some of which were naturally released much later, which vary in quality. Towards the end of the group's tenure, Harold Land leaves and Sonny Rollins comes in on tenor. The group, of course, comes to a tragic end on June 26, 1956, when Clifford, Richie, and Richie's wife are traveling from New York to Chicago to get to a gig. Richie's wife is driving, it's night, she loses control of the car, and all 3 are killed. Side 1 starts with Delilah, which is written by Victor Young, and it's, of course, the theme song to the Hollywood movie Samson and Delilah. On this first record by the group, this is such an excellent introduction. It swings gloriously. It's the epitome of everything that was good about 1950s bop. Land and Brown are in great form in their solos. Roach, I think, plays his solo with mallets. Every single note is played with impeccable taste. Parisian Thoroughfare, which is written by Richie's brother Bud, as the title of the song suggests, starts off with this kind of hurrying, almost traffic-like feeling with some accents from the horns giving you the sound of traffic. Eventually, however, it starts to swing really hard under Land's solo. Brown matches the mood, and then Roach solos again, and there's a bit of a pattern developing here. A bit tricky if you're a drummer leading a group. Do you solo every time? Well, if you're Art Blakey or Elvin Jones, no, you don't always solo every time. Roach is not able to resist. Now, it's understandable. He's got so much to say, and his solos are amazing, but it is just something to bear in mind. The final track on side 1, The Blues Walk, is not far removed from the days of bebop. There's a really frenetic feel to this. It's a real throwback to the 1940s. Not entirely to my taste, but Land really stands out here, and Roach's solo kills. Side 2 starts with Dahoud, which is this up-tempo bop number which became a standard. It's a great track. Brown's playing is just superb here. Next track on side 2 is Joy Spring, and this may be the best track on the whole record. It's just lovely. It's uplifting. Powell is comping in this very playful way, which just generally adds to the elevated mood of the whole song. Brown's solo is typically great, and at the end, both horns have this little interesting back and forth with Roach before he gets into his own solo. The second last track is Jordu by Duke Jordan. The standout player here, I think, is Land, who conjures this lovely, effortless, lazy feeling to his solo, which is echoed in turn by Richie Powell in his work. The record closes with What Am I Here For, which is a fine tribute to an Ellington classic. A nod here to George Morrow, whom I haven't really mentioned so far, but is just a machine on this track, and then a quirky solo by Roach to end it all, where he sounds for all the world like somebody falling down a flight of stairs. This is a fine record which deserves the esteem in which it's held. Harold Land in particular was not that well known before his work with Brown and Roach in 1954, but it's easy to see why his stock rose so quickly. He stayed within the bebop and hard bop idioms for most of his career. He's not what you would call revolutionary compared to some of his contemporaries, but his style and his tone were always appreciated. This record will be absolutely loved by 2 kinds of people: hard bop fans who think bebop faded from the scene a little too soon, and also by drummers. My own taste means it's not necessarily the first Brown and Roach record I reached for, but it has undeniable quality, and for me it's 4.5 out of 5 stars.